All right, everybody. So here's your job today. So on your way out, you received this document. Oh, I'm not on the picture. You received the document that has a picture of the whole world, and it's industrial transportation lines. Industrial transportation lines are large processes through, or large lines of transportation that move industrial goods, so manufacturing, stuff like that, commercial trains and trucks. What I'd like you to do is a 4-level map analysis of what you see on this map. So it's pretty simple. What do you see? Where do you see it? Where do you not see it? I need 5 observations on there. So be really specific about the types of areas. Don't just say Africa or South Asia or something like that. Why do you think it is where it is? And what are some surprises or some conclusions you can pull out of this map? On the back, I'd like you to specifically take a look at Africa. Now, we mentioned in class that Africa is pretty distinct in that pretty much these industrial lines weren't built by African nations. They're ruled by Western European nations, and they're headed straight to and stop at the resources that those developed nations wanted to pull from Africa. So then on the back side, you're going to write out 2 questions. I'm looking for 4 sentences, maybe 5 ideas a piece. Essentially, question 1 is, how are transportation and industrialization connected? And the second question is, how can a country that is industrialized impact those countries that are not? So you don't have to just think in terms of transportation. You can think broadly. So go ahead and pause the video. When you're done with that, you can go ahead and move on your slides. Oh, there we go. So here we have this in Europe. Now we're into notes. Europe has a highly sophisticated transportation line, even compared to us. So it's very easy to get from one point in Europe to another, whereas in Africa and other developing nations, it's not as easy. They don't have that infrastructure, is what we call anything that makes trade and transportation of goods easier. And they don't have a very sophisticated transportation system. So you might notice that only countries in Africa that are connected to this kind of railroad system or this infrastructure system or a movement system like the ocean are those successful countries in Africa. When we look at our map, we always look at the deep red in the middle of Africa. We kind of ignore the outer edges in the north of Africa. They're actually fairly successful compared to other countries. One industrial transportation system that we utilize a lot in the United States are highway systems. The lighter something is on this map, the more there is of it. So you notice once again that where industry is, where development is, we have infrastructure and transportation. Where it is not, we have the least amount of those things. And so infrastructure is a key to industry. It doesn't matter how many goods you can create if you can't transport those goods to where they need to be. Here's just another World Highways map, just a different look at it. So there were different phases in the Industrial Revolution. You just need to know these because they're still going. We've got the first phase, which we talked about in class, textiles and goods like that. In the 1870s, we had the mass production of those things that are used to create the things that are used to make like all the industry. Like we started producing steel and oil, which gave us skyscrapers and factories and trains and trucks and all that sort of stuff that then allowed us to do more industry. This was made possible by something called Fordist mass production, or just mass production. In the 1910s, we invented, Henry Ford stole the idea for the assembly line, which essentially means that instead of each person building a whole motorcycle, as you see in the bottom left corner, each person just does a piece of the motorcycle. They become a sort of machine, and that motorcycle passes them as they stand still, and they do their little part. Right? We're creating now super mass production. Now we're even making faster and faster and faster everything. And at this time, the cost of cars went, so it was a luxury good, down to where even a regular American could afford it. And the same is true for other things. Step 4 is what we call post-Fordism. It's the 1950s to now. It's like things are changing. We're getting better at at mass production, but nothing has really drastically changed. Though post-Fordism has a lot to do with factories and robots, we don't quite know what the next step is. Probably something to do with virtual reality, or probably something to do with 3D printing or robots and AI, who knows, right? But now that we've got that, the whole point is to try to figure out where these factories and industries should be located. And we need to figure out what factors determine where you're going to find a factory, right? Why do we always see Toyota dealerships in the same areas in town, and why does it matter? So there are two types of factors that we're going to talk about. The first is situation factors, which is how close these manufacturers are to the markets and materials where they sell things. Essentially, if you're a Toyota dealership, you want to be close to where people buy Toyotas and close to where the materials that make Toyotas are, like steel and computers. I don't know car stuff yet. And then there are also site factors. What factors are unique to the site that make it better for your particular site? Is it flat land? Is there a good freeway system? Is there that kind of stuff? The first of situation factors, we as geographers use pretty much one idea. And we're going to go over this in class. I want you just to write down some initial notes. And it's called Weber's least cost theory, Weber, maybe, least cost theory. And essentially, it's about where you put a factory or industry is where you can minimize the costs of transportation, of raw materials, and of the good itself. The first is just regular transportation costs. How much does it cost to move a raw material to a factory, and how much does it cost to move the finished product to the market? He also says, this is the most important one. The second most is how much does labor cost? So you want to also have it somewhere where it's cheap. If you determine that's right in between the forest where you get the wood and the market where you sell the wood, you want to go where there's cheap labor. And then also something called, you want to be near an agglomeration. An agglomeration is a clustering of similar industries that can then benefit from the same infrastructure. Things like train tracks or freeway systems, or like in Atlanta, all the movie theaters now go to Atlanta because they have tax write-offs, stuff like that. And essentially, Weber's job is to figure out where you're going to find factories in the United States. Tomorrow, we're going to go over the types of goods that change the way you look at Weber's least cost theory, but make sure you know it for tomorrow.